One of the most prominent figures in the Romantic era is Johannes Brahms. Born in 1833 in Hamburg, Germany, he would become a renowned composer and a household name. He's often grouped together with Bach and Beethoven as one of the three Bs. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Brahms' parents were supportive of his musical aspirations. This was due to his father, Johann Jacob Brahms, was a professional bassist in the Stadttheater Hamburg and the Hamburg Philharmonic Society. His father was a string, wind, and horn player. Although his parents were supportive of him, they were not as enthusiastic about his dreams to compose, because they didn't think he'd make as much money. Little did they know, their son would become one of the greatest composers of the day.
Back in my hometown, there was a local ice cream chain named Brahms. Different spelling, of course. But it's funny because when I was a child, I actually thought it was named after my favorite Romantic era composer. Of course, that was back before I was an expert in my field, and I was still in my schooling.
High school?
Yes. But speaking about Johannes Brahms, his music is so defining to me because it is filled with expression and emotions that are often based on the events of his life, which is something I can relate to. Stylistically, many of his contemporaries fully embraced the evolving trends of the time and evolved with them, and whereas Brahms took bits and pieces of them, he still remained true to the traditions of past centuries.
Brahms began composing at a very young age. His first piano teacher, Otto Friedrich Willibald Kossel, grew frustrated with how much Brahms liked to compose. By the age of 12, he had written a piano sonata in G minor. In these early years, he wrote piano music, chamber music, even music for male choirs, and even had some of his piano arrangements and fantasies published under the pseudonym G.W. Marx. Interestingly enough, in his later life, Brahms made a considerable effort to erase all of his earlier works, all the way up until his Scherzo Opus 4 and the song Heimkehr Opus 7 No. 6, both of which he premiered in 1851. These are the earliest of his works that he actually acknowledged. Brahms had his roots in Bach. He loved traditional styles, and later in his life, he would staunchly denounce the Impressionism that was characteristic of the emerging New German school. This included the writing of his contemporary Richard Wagner, which is ironic because Brahms actually liked Wagner.
Brahms, like so many composers of this era, was a hopeless romantic. It would be impossible for me to talk about his romantic life without mentioning his relationships with the Schumanns. It all started back in 1850, when Robert Schumann was visiting Hamburg. Brahms was only 17 at the time, but his friends persuaded him to send Schumann some of his compositions. This first attempt to contact Schumann actually failed, as Schumann returned his package unopened. In 1850, Brahms also met the Hungarian violinist Ede Reményi, and after playing in many recitals for him, the two went on tour. On their tour, they visited the violinist and composer Joseph Joachim at Hanover. Joachim listened to Brahms and was so impressed by his skill that he wrote, "Never, in the course of my artist life, have I been more completely overwhelmed." He wrote a letter of introduction for Brahms that would lead him to finally meeting Robert Schumann after he finished touring. Before I go on, I think it's funny to note that Brahms and Reményi on their tour actually met Franz Liszt, and according to Reményi, Brahms actually fell asleep while Liszt was performing his original sonata in B minor, which is actually quite an impressive feat if you've ever listened to Liszt's music.
Anyways, with his letter of introduction from Joseph Joachim, Brahms finally decided to visit Dusseldorf in 1853 and was welcomed by Robert and Clara Schumann. After their meeting, Robert Schumann was so impressed with Brahms that he published an article titled New Paths, in which he stated that Brahms was fated to give expression to the times in the highest and most ideal manner. It was honestly a little strange for Brahms to receive such high praise from Schumann. For starters, he was only 20 years old. And he even wrote about how he was unsure if he could live up to the idealized expectation that Schumann had described for him. At the same time, however, he was beyond grateful that one of his idols thought so highly of him. He wrote to Schumann, "Revered master, you have made me so extremely happy that I cannot attempt to express my thanks in words. May God grant that my works will soon be able to prove to you how much your love and kindness have uplifted and inspired me." The public was similarly shocked that Schumann had spoken so highly of someone who was relatively unknown. The publication allowed Brahms to grow in reputation and eventual fame and really started his career.
Brahms' friendship with Robert and Clara Schumann grew. However, it wasn't long until their relationships changed. 4 months after their initial meeting, Robert Schumann attempted to commit suicide by jumping off a bridge. He was confined and sent to a mental hospital near Bonn in 1854, where he would spend the next 2 years of his life before dying of pneumonia. He wasn't allowed to see his wife, Clara, out of fear of sending him into a spiral. So Brahms began to serve as a mediator between the two. He would visit and write to both Robert and Clara, and he soon began to handle their financials. His correspondence with Clara grew to be more frequent until eventually he would become her dearest friend and her closest confidant. She would later write to her children, saying, "You hardly knew your dear father. You were still too young to feel deep grief, and thus in those terrible years you could give me no comfort. Hope, indeed, you could bring me, but it was not enough to support me through such agony. Then came Johannes Brahms. Your father loved and admired him, as he did no man except the violinist Joseph Hakim. He came like a true friend to share all my sorrow. He strengthened the heart that threatened to break. He uplifted my mind. He cheered my spirit whenever and wherever he could. In short, he was my friend in the fullest sense of the word." After Robert's death, Clara was left alone to support her 7 kids, and so she began performing large concerts again. She would program her husband's work to keep his memory alive, but she would also program Brahms' work whenever it was appropriate.
Although Clara Schumann was 14 years older than Brahms, it is clear from some of their existing letters that Brahms cared deeply for her. At the beginning of their correspondence, when Brahms was only 21, he writes to her, "I will go home and play music and read to myself until you appear, and I can do so with you. If you wanted to please me very much indeed, you would let me find a letter in Dusseldorf. If the great longing that has possessed me during the last few days has any influence on my playing, it ought soon to enable me to cast a spell over people." 5 days later, he ended his letter by expressing a sentiment of endearment, saying, "I would gladly write to you only by means of music, but I have things to say to you today, which music could not express."
Although at the surface level their friendship was platonic, it is clear that Brahms grew to have romantic feelings for Clara, holding both her and her union with Robert in high esteem. He expresses his admiration for their marriage, writing, "Even I, before I knew you, imagined that such people as you and such marriages as yours could only exist in the imagination of the rarest people. People do not deserve that you two, Robert and Clara, should be on earth at all, and I feel uplifted when I think that I may see the time when people will idolize you. Two such holy, poetical natures. I almost wish that the world in general might forget you, so that you could remain all the more sacred to the elect." As the years went by, Brahms' feelings seemed to grow only deeper, which is something that is reflected in his letters to Clara. In a letter from August of 1855, he writes to Clara, "Clara, dear Clara, I feel ever more happy and peaceful in my love for you. Every time I miss you more, but I long for you almost with joy. That is how it is, and I knew the feeling already, but never quite so warm as it is now." In a letter from the following May, he goes even further, saying, "My beloved Clara, I wish I could write to you as tenderly as I love you and tell you all the good things that I wish you. You are so infinitely dear to me, dearer than I can say. I should like to spend the whole day calling you endearing names and paying you compliments without ever being satisfied." And yet, in another letter, he signs it saying, "With heartiest wishes for your welfare, and begging you to kiss me. Your Johannes."
Although there is some speculation of the nature of the relationship between the two, it is thought that Clara did not return Brahms' feelings of unrequited love. That being said, it is clear that through her existing letters, she did have a great deal of affection for him, and particularly admired his music. In a letter from July of 1858, Clara rejects the idea that her positive opinion of his music is based upon her blind enthusiasm for him, writing tenderly, "That I am often mightily captivated by the wealth of your genius, that you always seem to be one on whom heaven has showered its fairest gifts, and that I love you and honor you for so many magnificent qualities. All this is true, dearest Johannes, and has taken deep root in my heart, so do not try to kill it all in me by your cold philosophizing. It is impossible. I have always considered myself so fortunate to be able to be to you a friend who understands you, and who is in a position to recognize your value as a musician and as a man." Clara reveals how much comfort and love she finds in their friendship when at the end of her letter she writes, "I am waiting for another letter, my Johannes. If only I could find longing as sweet as you do. It only gives me pain and fills my heart with unspeakable woe. Farewell. Think kindly of your Clara. Write me as often as you can. One requires to be cheerful during a cure, and whence would good cheer come to me if not from you?" They stayed in touch, and their bond continued on throughout the years.
One of the reasons people do speculate that there may have been something more between Clara Schumann and Johannes Brahms is because at a point in their middle age, Clara set a boundary in the relationship and burned most of Brahms' letters. Brahms later did the same for hers. And because of this, historians do not know exactly what happened, and so I don't know that anyone can confidently say that they were or weren't anything more than just friends. Either way, Brahms' feelings for Clara eventually shifted to her daughter, Julie. During 1869, Brahms had felt himself falling in love with the Schumann's daughter, Julie. She was 24 and he was 36. And he did not declare himself, and so when her engagement to Count Marmarito was announced later that year, he decided to write and give to Clara his Alto Rhapsody, Opus 53, and Clara wrote in her diary that he called it his wedding song and noted the profound pain in the text and the music.
Brahms certainly captured his feelings in his music, and conveyed them in a masterful way. He never married throughout his life, but he wrote many songs that reflected his affection for others. Clara died in 1896, 11 months before he did, and her death prompted him to write his final cycles of piano pieces, the 4 serious songs.
Johannes Brahms was one of the most important figures of the Romantic era. He kept traditional forms alive while bringing his own emotion to his music. Speaking on his reluctance to change his music to fit with the evolving trends of the time and instead stay true to who he was, Arnold Schoenberg shares my favorite quote that I think holistically captures him. Johannes Brahms was not a conservative. He was simply a very conservative revolutionary.